The history of Spartacus continues to inspire new generations with its indelible spirit. Spartacus has endured the ages, while the actual account of the rebel leader has left scholars with more questions than definitive answers. The historians behind the Spartacus series, Irvin and Jeffrey Stevens, sat down to share existing research concerning the Spartacus legend.
We really only have 3 sources that give us anywhere near a complete narrative, not even necessarily of the man, just simply the war itself.
The information is so fragmentary and so sparse. Fragments of Sallust, Appian, Polybius, and a few other authors.
The great thing about these 3 sources, especially for historians, is that they contradict each other in a variety of different places. So as far as trying to get to who was Spartacus the man, we're not even really sure what he did.
And what you actually see in the sources is a very fragmented degree of rebellion where Spartacus was a primary leader.
We must stand as one or fall divided.
For the Roman historians especially, Spartacus acquired something of a kind of mythological context, where one of the Roman historians by the name of Sallust kind of took him and saw him in a, let's say, moralistic light, where he wanted to make him a morally upright slave who was battling against the decrepit, collapsing Roman Republic.
The Romans themselves did not consider him all that important in their historical sources. And in many ways, the Romans created certain attitudes about Spartacus, and they used it for their own political agenda.
You have references from other Romans, like Cicero, for example, who uses the term Spartacus as an insult that he flings at his enemies. In one speech, he calls Mark Antony a Spartacus, that all he wants to do is raid the Italian countryside, burn things down, steal things, rape women, so on and so forth.
As the revolt began, Rome was locked in combat with enemies throughout the empire. In Spain, Pompey was attacking renegade commander Sertorius. In Asia Minor, the Republic continued the on and off again struggle with King Mithridates. And in Crete, Mark Antony prepared to sail against pirates attacking Roman shipping lanes. War was a constant for the Republic, and the people defeated in these campaigns were a commodity held in little regard. As a result, Spartacus's true identity, where he came from, or how he became a slave, remains lost to history.
Whether or not he was actually from Thrace, was a Thracian, the Romans thought he was. So they gave him what they thought was a somewhat stereotypical Thracian name, kind of butchered and translated into Latin from what it might have originally been, and said, we think you're a Thracian, here's what we think is a good Thracian name, now go be a gladiator.
And many of the early gladiatorial types actually seem to be composed from different ethnic groups and peoples that were conquered by the Roman military machine. And the Romans themselves would often view anybody that was considered non-Roman as very, very barbarian.
One of the things we try to reflect in the show is this idea that racism and that prejudice does exist in the ancient world, that it is based on cultural stereotypes. It's not based on skin color. It's not based on the way you look. It's based on assumptions of where you come from.
And the Romans themselves like to build up an enemy like that. When you defeat that enemy, it builds yourself up.
Stripped of his freedom, Spartacus shared the fate of thousands of slaves. The suffering inflicted by the Romans would serve as a rallying cry for Spartacus to break the chains of tyranny. The Romans could not have predicted Spartacus's shrewd maneuver in building an army out of the ranks they had unknowingly provided.
Rome has, for almost a century and a half in the 70s BC, been in constant warfare. And so from all of these regions, the men are killed, the women and children are all sold into slavery. Entire cities, entire populations of people converted into slaves.
Shackle will be struck from every slave upon our path. We will see our numbers grow.
Rome could bring in anybody that it did capture, men, women, children, and basically bring them back to service whatever needs they provided.
We know that the revolt and escape began in Capua, that Spartacus was a part of a ludus owned by an individual whose name is variously rendered as Lentulus or Lentulus Batiatus, that there were actually at least 2 attempts to escape. The first attempt, somebody apparently broke and informed the master. A second escape was then planned. Only 74 were able to escape.
They were not going to hole up in any one location for too long. They did hole up around Vesuvius for their own reasons, probably a certain degree of protection and just a decent, central point from which to operate on in its initial stages.
They managed to arm themselves significantly, and of course, being gladiators, they were already trained in combat. And from there, the narrative spins off in various directions.
Roman politics were ruled by status and the need to achieve glory to further elevate one's name. The Senate recognized that there was nothing to be gained in a police action against common criminals. This is most evident in the senator's decision to send a praetor of low standing, Gaius Claudius Glaber, to end the rebellion.
For the Romans at that time, it really wasn't a whole lot to worry about. That certainly helps Spartacus in his revolt.
This is one of the kind of big mistakes that the Romans made, is because Spartacus was considered, a leader of rabble. It was basically just considered, a small little disturbance at first, and they did not pay serious attention to it.
And why should the Romans care at first? It's 74 guys with swords running around the Capuan countryside. They're slaves. It's nothing to worry about.
Every time he was able to defeat a Roman army, it would just cause that much more success. That many more slaves and disenfranchised people might well flock to him. So not everybody that followed Spartacus was a slave, but the huge slave population really helped his success.
On the Roman side, it's still Glaber with his levied forces, his volunteer forces, the groups that he is able to glean from the Italian countryside. You're not going to send a legion against a bunch of slaves on a mountainside. For the Romans, anyway, that would be overkill. And they don't have the resources to really engage in overkill at the time.
As Spartacus and his ranks swelled, it definitely became a real problem that the Romans had to address.
And then Rome gradually begins to take more and more notice, especially as he begins defeating more and more armies and magistrates that are sent against him.
Spartacus was an innovator. He kept his people on the move, conducted ambushes, would turn his forces suddenly to face pursuing legions, and often maneuvered to outflank attacking troops. In contrast, the Republic had grown so big, they remained set in their ways. They were ponderous, slow, and they believed their might would defeat the barbarian style of fighting.
It really shows for the first time how Spartacus can truly have a chance to be successful against a structured Roman army. It may not have been the greatest army, but Spartacus kind of was able to show everybody around Italy that he could face the Romans directly and prevail.
Spartacus becomes something of a rallying point for a variety of different people who are dissatisfied with Rome, with the Republic, with the way Roman politics have gone.
In terms of long-term repercussions from the Spartacus rebellion, is it did expose certain cracks within Roman society itself. And the fact that this huge slave population that Rome had amassed over the prior 2 centuries had risen up under Spartacus to become such a threat.
Spread word to every slave yet beneath heel that even the mighty Republic bleeds when struck.
And from that point on, he was no longer just a gladiator who happened to escape. He became this rallying cry throughout all of Italy that you don't have to simply put up with Rome. You don't have to put up the system.
In many cases, he's been almost a legendary construct of the Romans themselves to represent certain things about their society.
You see the Romans kind of inventing backstories for him, or at least trying to put something together. Where is he from? Who is he? How is he able to beat us? Some of what they put together, it may be true. Maybe he is from Thrace. Maybe he did serve with the Roman legions.
Much of what we know about Spartacus now has been through the lens and the interpretation of more recent thoughts about Spartacus, starting with Rousseau, all the way up through more socialist and communistic elements through the 20th century.
So as far as who was the real man, he's utterly lost to history, and he has become, for the Romans, either a paragon of Roman virtues and Roman morality and an example of what all good Romans should try to be, or an example of barbarity and what happens when you let slaves have too much freedom